Okay, we arrived.
Thank you. So here we are again. Okay. So welcome all. A very warm welcome to all of you joining us this evening to this virtual event with Colleen Doran, hosted by the Athens Comics Library, with the support and the collaboration of the US Embassy in Athens and the Comic-Con, the Thessaloniki Comic-Con. For those who don't know us, Athens Comics Library is a place of inspiration, creativity, and collaboration built around a collection of almost 3,000 comics and graphic novels. And we invite you all to visit us when we open again. And let me tell you here that the US Embassy in Athens has been supporting us since day one. And this event is part of that long-term collaboration. And of course, as you might imagine, we have planned differently to fly Colleen over here in Athens, but the pandemic changed our plans. However, we strongly believe that we still have to be active and connected with our communities, and during those challenging times. And April for us is usually convention time, so a double thanks to Colleen and the US Embassy in Athens for allowing us to recreate the feeling and the atmosphere of our festival through this series of virtual events. And now I would like to ask Ms. Jennifer Suller, Cultural Attaché of the US Embassy in Athens, to address a brief welcome.
Well, thank you, Lida. Kalispera sas. I'm really excited to be here today with all of you. Let me start by thanking the Athens Comics Library for their wonderful collaboration in organizing this presentation. Of course, I would also like to extend a heartfelt thank you to Colleen Doran for joining us and for sharing her insights with all of us today. This is a program that, as Lida said, we began planning a year ago, aiming to welcome Colleen to Athens and Thessaloniki for a real-life visit. As we all know, the world had other plans for all of us, but we are very fortunate to be able to continue with this initiative by moving it into the virtual space today. Colleen is a celebrated comic creator with many years of experience in the field, and I know we're all looking forward to your presentation, Colleen. I'm also looking forward to learning more about your career in a male-dominated industry and hearing about how you've helped bring female heroines to the forefront of comic storytelling. US President Biden and Vice President Harris have made diversity and inclusion a clear priority for the United States, and the US Embassy here in Greece has been proud to support these priorities with our programs and initiatives. Tonight's discussion is part of a diverse portfolio of programming that we have created to highlight women's voices and empower female professionals. These programs include workshops that provide coding and digital training for women and girls, support female entrepreneurship, and share best practices by connecting American and Greek professionals working on these issues. We are also proud to support programs that bring together creative professionals from the United States and Greece. Especially this year, as Greece celebrates the 200th anniversary of its War of Independence, the US Embassy is happy to support a series of cultural and educational programs that highlight the strong friendship and close partnership between our two countries and peoples. So I hope that tonight's presentation is one that will both connect and inspire us. Thank you again to Colleen for joining us, and to Lida, Dina, and Dimitris of the Athens Comics Library, as well as the Thessaloniki Comic-Con team for bringing this program to life. Finally, thank you all for joining us. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Your mute's on, Lida.
Thank you. So with no further ado, I would like to warmly welcome Colleen Doran to this session tonight. Colleen, we are very much looking forward to hear your inspiring journey through comics. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I am pleased and honored and very grateful to be with you here today. I'm so excited that you're interested in comics. and are all here today to talk about them. I was asked to be here to discuss my work with you and answer some questions, but I'll also be talking about some of the history of women in comics that might be a little bit obscure, that you may not have heard about before, and how some of the people I met along the way helped me get to where I am today, because we know we don't do it alone. More importantly, I am going to take some time to give you some advice that is probably more relevant to how you can break into the comics industry. I got in 40 years ago. That was a long time. The world has changed. And the market is very, very different. So I'm going to take at least a little bit of this discussion to try to give you some advice about what you can do as well that is more current and more relevant to what you need. There are so many people to thank and to remember. If we're high up, it's because other people help lift us up. And it's an incredible privilege to work on great classic characters like Wonder Woman, who is such a terrific example to young people all over the world. I hope every day I can be a good example and a better person, and a person to live up to the responsibility of working with such a beloved character who represents hope to so many. Thank you so much for being here. I try to infuse my work with life and joy and character, and to bring a unique perspective to my approach to comics, especially with regard to my storytelling techniques when I'm working on more personal projects. But one of the things I want people to know is that even though I eventually ended up working for some pretty cool clients on big name projects, such as the ones you see here, I didn't come by that via wealth and great privilege. My family was extremely poor. We went hungry, and I did not get to go to an art school for training in art. In fact, such training did not exist in universities when I started out. There's a Wikipedia entry about me that goes on about the schools I went to, but I didn't get to go to art school until I'd been a pro for over 20 years, and all I did was take a beginner digital art class online. The brief time I went to university, it was on scholarship. I majored in business, and I left school when the scholarship money ran out. The 2 art classes I did take were pretty much independent study, and I barely spoke to an art teacher. I've had no formal training in art and none in comics at all. Anyone who is diligent and wants to take the time and sit down and practice and practice and practice has the chance to make it in comics. One big difference between the comic industry when I got started and the comic book industry world we are in today is comics is now seen as a really cool job that a lot of people want. But when I first got into comics some 40 years ago, and I've been a working pro since I was a teenager, and I'm now in my mid-50s, back then comics were seen as a lowbrow, low-class profession. It was something you did because you couldn't get a good paying job in advertising. And even the great Stan Lee was sometimes embarrassed to admit to people that he wrote comic books. Here's art I drew from Stan Lee's autobiography, Amazing, Fantastic, Incredible Stan Lee, showing one of Stan's memories of this. Even though Stan's old enough to be my grandfather, when I was starting out, and in fact until about the last decade or so, working in comics was just not a cool job. If you were working in comics, it was because you could not get a real job, a real art job, or you were kind of a weirdo. It was extremely unusual for girls to want to work in this business, and none of the cool kids wanted anything to do with it. It was social poison to be seen as a geek or a nerd, and almost no one self-identified as a geek. It seems like everyone wants to be called a geek these days, but back then, no one wanted to be seen as brainy or nerdy. The first conventions I went to were science fiction conventions, and they were really small. And there were times I'd be one of few girls at the entire show. And I didn't go to comic book conventions at all until after I became a pro artist. They were not popular. often just a couple hundred people meeting in a hotel, and there were times I was the only girl at the entire show. In some ways, that made it much easier to break in because there were fewer people trying to get in. Now, this was all before the days of the internet, and if you went to a convention to show your portfolio, you might be there with only 20 other artists. Now you go to a big show and there are 2,000 artists trying to get seen by an editor. So in some ways, getting attention was much easier when I got started. Of course, without the internet, you had to mail in your art to potential clients or be at a show or go to the publisher's office. There was no Twitter, no DeviantArt portfolio where people could see your stuff. You had to show it to them in person. But flights used to be so cheap that I could get a $56 ticket, fly to New York City in the morning, deliver my assignments, meet my editor, and fly home in the evening by 7 p.m. And I did that a lot in the 1980s and 1990s, and that helped my career a lot. Just fly in and fly back, and I saw, 5, 6 editors that day. Breaking into publishing, though, has never really been that hard. I know this sounds hard to believe, but just stick with me for a minute here. I think people confuse the idea of breaking in with getting decent paying work. That's the hard part. There are all kinds of ways to self-publish. There are web comics, there are blogs. The real trick is staying in and having a paying career. And I've been very lucky to be able to stick it out all this time and work on some exciting projects with wonderful people like Stan Lee, and for companies like Marvel and DC and Disney and Lucasfilm. I never dreamed there would be such an amazing scope of opportunity for creators like we have now, such a wide range of possibilities for all kinds of creators. And I love that there are so many books and projects and artists of all kinds, and I feel lucky to still be a part of it. And of course, I've had the great privilege of meeting some amazing, fantastic, incredible people along the way. These are just a few of my recent projects with my favorite writer, Neil Gaiman. And I can now say that after all these years in publishing, I'm doing exactly what I've always wanted to do with my work. That is to carefully pick and choose my projects without having to worry about immediate financial needs or tight deadlines, and to cultivate unique styles for each project, taking my time with the art and doing my very best. From where I started out, I didn't think where I ended up was even a realistic possibility. Comics can be a real meat grinder, especially if you're working on a regular web comic or monthly print comic. You have to produce such high volume. I admired bande dessinée for many years, bande dessinée, European comics, French, Belgian. And I dreamed of being the kind of artist who would be able to lavish my time on a page instead of working on tight deadlines. And being able to work on projects such as the ones you see here is a dream come true for me. So here's a look at some projects that I loved, and Chivalry there on the far right isn't even out yet. That won't be out until September. I want to emphasize that while I'm very happy with my life and work, and believe I'm incredibly privileged and lucky to be where I am, getting to this point was pretty difficult. The first decade of my career, I was treated pretty badly. I was very poor. I lived below poverty level, and I am extremely grateful to a number of people, including some very powerful people who gave me encouragement and support. I credit them for helping me get through some very bad times. When I first got into the industry, discrimination was very common, but there wasn't any recourse if you were treated badly. You pretty much just had to hope to get a chance to get away from whoever was bad to you and eventually go work for someone who wasn't bad to you. Today, people have more options to get published and speak out, and there are still things, happening that shouldn't be going on. But back then, there wasn't much you could do at all, and there were only a few publishers to to choose from. I wanted more than anything to be a cartoonist, and I just wasn't going to let anything stop me. But going through bad times would be an understatement, and I almost gave up more than once. Bizarrely, many men in the industry at the time didn't think women liked comics, read comics, or were good at making comics, especially superheroes, and any information to the contrary was simply ignored. There were plenty of women in comics who believed the same thing. One well-known woman blogger, when I kept insisting I really liked superheroes, told me that my opinion didn't count because women who liked superheroes were an anomaly and didn't represent real women. Now, it's best to ignore stuff like that and get on doing with what you really want to do, but it's discouraging to hear that when you hear it over and over year after year. It was very common, and still is, for people to think there were no women in comics in the past, and if there were, they only liked or did romance comics, that there were only a few women creators, and many people mistakenly believe that women have only had a real voice in the sequential art medium during the last decade or so. It's just not true. Some of my greatest artistic influences were women who were making cartoons and comic books over a century ago. And I just want to give you some historical context here, because as I've said, women in comics didn't just appear over the last decade. This is the Bayeux Tapestry, a 230-foot-long needlepoint cartoon strip depiction of the Battle of Hastings. Undoubtedly, the labor on this piece is by women, though there is some debate as to who designed the work, but it is one of many examples of sequential style art long before comic books came along. You will read many arguments which promote the idea that this culture or that culture invented comics or manga, but every major culture has some representation of early sequential art attempts going back thousands of years. In their temples, scrolls, illuminated manuscripts, hieroglyphics, friezes, cave paintings, and sculptures. This is just one example of how universal sequential art storytelling is, and it is a definitive example of how women participated in this art form going back at least 1,000 years. While none of these scrolls or friezes or manuscripts are true comic books, they show how human beings communicate via words and images in ways that attempt to show the passage of time and to manipulate an understanding of space and form in a sequence. This is the essence of comics, even though it is not yet a comic book. Comic books wouldn't truly be created until the invention of cheap pulp printing techniques for mass production centuries later. But the Bayeux Tapestry is a proto-comic strip. And I want to talk for a minute about one of the earliest women comics I never hear get mentioned by anyone. This is Marie Duval. She was the co-creator of Ally Sloper, which was written by her husband, Charles Henry Ross. Marie Duval is one of a number of her pseudonyms. She was actually an actress as well, and she was one of the first professional female cartoonists in all of Europe. She worked in the British penny papers and in comics from the 1860s to the 1880s. She created many inventive page layouts and storytelling techniques that would not be seen in comics again for decades, and her work was collected in book form, a comic book some 60 years before the publication of the first Superman story in Action Comics, often credited as the first modern comic book. I just never see her mentioned in articles about the development of cartoons or the development of the comic book form, even though she was quite popular. Her work was widely disseminated, and it was reprinted in book form, just like Superman newspaper strips were. Duval died when she was in her 40s. Her original art seems to have completely disappeared, and her name was left off reprintings of her work, effectively wiping her from history. But you can learn more about her by visiting the website marieduval.org. For centuries, women artists were considered a rarity and generally inferior in skill to men. Women were forbidden to receive the same training in arts as men, as it was believed that the study of the human body would make women immodest. They were excluded from anatomy classes. In the late 1800s to early 1900s, these attitudes began to change, and working girls were actively encouraged to study art as a vocation. Decorative and illustration art was seen as a healthy job prospect for women and girls, as fine art was considered beyond their abilities. Ads like this one that encouraged girls to take commercial art classes popped up in newspapers around this time. And during the golden age of illustration, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, a number of women illustrators and cartoonists rose to prominence, such as Jessie Wilcox Smith, Violet Oakley, and Beatrix Potter. During the golden age of illustration, Howard Pyle is widely credited as creating an entire school of American art known as the Brandywine School, and he was greatly admired by artists such as Vincent van Gogh. He was one of the first men to allow women creators to attend his art classes, and many of the most prominent of these illustrators of the time came from this school, including Smith, Oakley, and Elizabeth Shippen Green. You're looking at Jessie Wilcox Smith there on the left and Beatrix Potter on the right. However, despite his progressive moves, Pyle later decided that women entering an art career harmed them because it interfered with their prospects of marriage and home life. And now we get to talk about my idol. This is Rose O'Neal. One of the things that drives me crazy is today I run into people who claim that women have never experienced discrimination in the arts. This is a 1915 quote by Rose O'Neal. I have a thrilling hope that women are going to do something glorious in the arts. It is my passionate conviction. I'm always indignant when women are denied creative power in art. Women have spoken out about how they've been shunted aside for centuries from picture making, from the creative community. And Rose O'Neal was one of the most successful and powerful illustrators of her day. I first learned about her when I was a kid, when I read Maurice Horn's World Encyclopedia of Comics at my local library. I noticed there weren't many women in this book, and I also noticed that no matter how well they drew, and Rose O'Neal drew better than most, the women were almost always written off in dismissive terms. After reading about her, I tracked down everything I could find about her and was amazed at her incredible talent and massive success. She was a cartoonist and illustrator, but she was also a fine artist, a painter, a sculptor, and she had worldwide success with her creation of her franchise, the Cupies, one of the first licensing of a cartoon in franchise history. This made her a millionaire. You can see her designs for the patent of her Cupid doll co-credited to her sister Callista on the right of this image. Her career began at age 13 when she entered a contest, with the winning drawing being so well conceived that the judges had a hard time she'd actually done it, so they made her sit down and do another while they watched. He was immensely successful and popular, was able to travel the world studying art and sculpture in Paris with Rodin, and she was elected to the Société Coloniale des Artistes Français in 1921 and had exhibitions of her sculptures at the Galerie de Vambeau in Paris and the Wildenstein Galleries in New York. I was offended on behalf of Rose O'Neal that so many contemporary scholars dismissed the scope of her work as merely cute. She became my idol, and every time someone told me that women couldn't be successful in comics, I thought of her. Another of my idols is Ethel Hayes, creator of the strip Flapper Fanny. Hayes was primarily known for her comic strips, but she was also a well-regarded children's book illustrator, and her career lasted for decades. She died at age 97. While neither Hayes nor O'Neill worked in comic books, they both drew so beautifully and were so successful before modern comic books even existed that I wanted to bring something of the style and elegance of their era and their success with me into my comic book world. Their excellent examples of skill and career scope shaped my career choices. Like O'Neill, I started in commercial art when I was a teenager, landing my first job for an advertising agency when I was about 14 or 15. The lady who hired me, Linda Wesley, says I was 14, but I honestly don't know because I can't remember back that far. Regardless, I had no idea that there was a mindset among many that women could not and should not work in comics. You can see that women did and always have done so. It wasn't until years later that I came to understand that in the mid-1950s, when superhero comics came to dominate the market, comic book publishers focused entirely on producing work of interest to young boys. Now, this didn't deter me in the least because I loved superheroes. But more and more over time, owing to cultural and economic factors that aren't really the scope of this talk, superheroes were targeted less at general audiences and more at boys and young male adults. Most women and girls stopped consuming comic books, and the idea that women don't read or work in comics took hold. And when I was first starting out as a pro, even though I was already getting published by major clients, the situation I was in was very discouraging, and I felt that many of the jobs I was getting were tokenizing and stereotyping. It was limiting because there just wasn't much of a market for you if you got stuck with the girl cartoonist label. Now, I got into comics because I loved superheroes, but I was annoyed that the US market was so limited in its outlook about what comics could be. I was introduced to manga by underground comics artist Leslie Sternberg, who told me she thought they reminded her of my work. Now, most of the shoujo manga people feel must have influenced my art were not even published when I first developed my comic style. So any resemblance you may see there did not originally come from manga. Manga was not at all popular or widely available in the USA when I was a girl. However, I learned from Fred Schott's book, Manga, The World of Japanese Comics, which I think I first saw sometime around 1985, that there was a robust market for comics created by women and girls in Japan, even though we were being told in the USA that such a thing could not exist. While I don't consider manga to be a major influence on my art in general, with most of the things people see in my projects that resemble, manga that's actually coming from Western resources, knowing that there was a market out there for women and girls was inspiring. And this is The Rose of Versailles by Ryoki Ikeda, and this is from 1973. I didn't see this until around 1984 and 1985, but I was totally hooked by it. I loved this book. And all that may seem like an odd detour, but when I was first starting in comics and things weren't so encouraging, knowing a broader history of comics and women's contributions to the medium helped me stick to my guns. And now I get to draw cool things like this, which is my original pen and ink art for DC Comics Generations Forged. This just came out, by the way. I wanted to just take some time to talk to you about how I got from here to there, and I didn't do any of this in my career without a long history of women in comics who came before me, and I think it's important to thank those who paved the way, some of whom are written out of history. And we've all got to start somewhere, and this is fanzine art I did for a Dungeons and Dragons fanzine when I was around, 13 years old maybe. You'd think by then I'd have learned how to draw panel borders. This is really terrible. I'm sure your eyes are bleeding. Let's move along quickly. Now, this was my first professional comics assignment. This was Miss Fury. It was created as a comic strip in 1941 by artist June Tarp Mills and a gentleman named Tom Long, who did a small press publication called Graphic Showcase. something started in the 1960s, wanted to revive the strip, and this was some of my art for it. He discovered some great comics creators like Bernie Wrightson, Mike Kaluta, and science fiction illustrators like Steve Hickman. Now, by today's professional standards, I think Graphic Showcase would have, well, by the standards of the day, Graphic Showcase would have been considered to be a fanzine. By today's standards, it would be considered a professional publication, and I was paid for my work there, but it never came out because it was too adult for me, and I had to quit. But I was discovered at a convention. I would bring my portfolio, I put my art up in shows, and a number of people saw my stuff, and they started trying to give me jobs. This was the villainous for the story. I don't have the rest of the art. I don't know what happened to it, but this was some of my first work. And this is just a year or so later. I think you can see a big improvement in the art, but you can also see a big mistake that a lot of new creators make. And that is, the reason this page looks so much better is because I would spend days or weeks picking at it. And some of my very early work looks a lot better than some of my later work because I was spending so much time on it. As a professional, you don't get days or weeks to work on a single page. There are so many cases when creators come to you with fantastic page samples. You think, wow, I'm going to hire this person. And then under pressure or on deadline, the art doesn't look so good. And I figured out pretty early on this was going to be a problem and tried to change my approach. And one big advantage that I had was I had story pages like this. The biggest mistake we see over and over and over again in newbie portfolios is it's just pinup after pinup after pinup. People standing there, cute character designs, that sort of thing. You need to have continuity. You need to have storytelling. I would say 9 out of 10 portfolios that we see do not have basic storytelling skills on display. If you don't have that, you're not going to be able to get a job. And this is further illustration of how unrealistic my early expectations are. This is some of my earliest professional comics work. It took me a week to do this page. Not good. I was getting something like $1 an hour. And the public is generally unwilling to wait for comic books that are only done at the rate of a page a week. It's a very unrealistic expectation, and a lot of newbies don't understand this. But the artwork looks nice. It's very pretty. It's highly rendered, but you can't make a career out of this unless you're willing to find someone who's willing to pay you a lot of money so that you can spend an entire week working on a single page. Now, there's only about 1 or 2 years between the last slide and this page. This is actually earlier than the last slide, but it was one of my first early attempts at superhero comic style inking and trying to learn to draw within realistic comic book deadlines. One thing I did that you should all do, especially if you're starting out, is keep a time record of your productivity. I would record the amount of time it took me to do a page in the corner of every page to see if I could make deadlines. Now here I am trying to draw like John Byrne, and my lettering and everything is terrible. This is another big mistake that newbies make. Do not letter your own stuff unless you're good at it. It really brings your art down, even if you draw well. In fact, on a lot of my earlier pages, like which page was it? Let's see. This page before, when I realized my big mistake of lettering my own stuff, I went back and erased it. But of course, this is in ink, and I couldn't do that. Most people aren't very good at digital lettering either. If it's not something you really need to have in your portfolio as samples, don't do it. There's a reason there are professional letterers. They make a huge difference. I think it was about 17 maybe when I drew this. It's not too bad for a kid, but the lettering is terrible. I had no idea what I was doing. Leave the lettering off unless you're going to be a letterer. And here is my work over a decade later, getting to draw those characters in a professional publication for Marvel Comics. This was for Mutant X. As you can see, there's something of an improvement here. These are my uninked pencils. And some people get upset when I complain about this, but a big impediment to my early career was that I was working on tight deadlines most of the time, not getting to do my best stuff. And this is tight penciling, very clean, but there's what you draw and there's what makes it to publication. And one of the things that's going to hold you back is if you don't get a good inker. About 20 years ago, I stopped working with inkers entirely because usually only the A-list artists were getting the good inkers, and if you weren't A-list, God only knows what your work was going to look like when it made it to publication. You're really not going to shine in most of your early assignments because you get the fill-ins, you get the hard jobs. It's really very rare when I was starting out for a newbie like me to get a plum treatment. You see publishers giving new creators star treatment right out the gate. That rarely happened when I was a kid. So yeah. If you're not going to ink your own stuff, if you're not good at it and your pencils are solid, don't ink at all. But if you do ink your own stuff, keep copies of your pencil art as well as copies of your ink art in your portfolio. You can show publishers what you're capable of and what the before and after looked like. You never know, you may end up getting jobs as an inker even if you don't get jobs as a penciler. And I want to take a minute to talk about some of the people who were very influential and very helpful to me. This is the cover of Queen's album News of the World. It's by artist and illustrator Frank Kelly Freeze. He was my mentor when I was growing up. And I certainly went through some experiences where people told me to just give it up and I was never going to be any good and whatever. But Frank Kelly Freeze was the dean of science fiction artists. He won more Hugo Awards than any other artist at the time. I'm not sure what the situation is now, but Kelly was universally beloved, and he was unwaveringly supportive of my work and my career early on. And that made an enormous difference in my ability to stick it out. When you have somebody you don't respect and who you don't think is a very good artist telling you stink and you should go get a day job, and you have somebody like Frank Kelly Freeze telling you you've got the chops and stick with it, that's big. So Frank Kelly Freeze, go look him up. He's just a wonderful, wonderful man. You might recognize his work from Mad Magazine. He did a lot of pictures of the character Alfred E. Newman, the guy with the big ears on the cover of Mad. He was such a big supporter of my work, and this is some of my earliest work, series I created, wrote, and drew, even do everything on this thing, including the lettering by hand. I just had some epic, awful experiences starting out, and he would have me come over to his house and we just talk for hours. My early experiences on this were so bad that I took all of the original art from a previous edition of it that I could find, and I burned it. I think I just read Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, but it felt great to rise from the ashes, and I'm still working on this project to this day. I first created the characters and concepts when I was about 12 years old, and it's in multiple printings and editions now, and it's published by Shadowline Comics, an imprint of Image Comics. And one of the first people to see art for this was Frank Kelly Freeze. So thank you, Kelly. And this is another one of my great inspirations and early supporters. This is Keith Giffen. When I was about 17 years old, I was working on a fanzine called Interlac. It was actually called the Napazine, but nobody knows what they are anymore, and I can be here all day explaining it. We'll just call it a fanzine. And they had really low circulation, maybe about 100 copies, but of those 100 copies, maybe a dozen or so would go to professionals at the comic book companies. And Keith Giffen was one of the people who got the zine. And he saw my work in it. And this Elements piece over there is some of my work from that zine. And he called me up on the phone, because back then we were just, it was a very different world. You put your phone and your address in these zines and hope that people would contact you, and you like would never do that now. But he called me up on the phone and got my mom, and Keith's like, oh, can I speak to Colleen Doran? And Mom is like, oh, well, she's at school. Keith is like, what? She's a kid? But he called me up and asked me if I'd like to audition to draw the Legion of Superheroes. And because I'm an idiot, I actually turned down that opportunity because I was actually afraid of it, and I had already agreed to do a job for a small press. Boy, was that a big mistake. But this is another example of an established pro going out of his way to help a kid. We are still friends decades later, and we still work together. I consider him one of the best friends I've ever had, and all because one day he saw a kid's work and said, I want to hire that kid, and picked up the phone. Pretty cool. This is some of the work I do on A Distant Soil. This is fairly recent work. Most of my work on it is by hand. This cover over here on the right is some of my earliest digital work, and it's the first A Distant Soil cover I did by hand. But the lettering and all of the line work you see there on the left, that's all by hand. I don't know why I'm still doing it all by hand at this point. It's kind of, I don't know, neurotic, I guess. But because I did learn by hand, in some ways, sticking to drawing it by hand is faster than digital. You just get so used to being able to do these things, and you've either got the hand-eye coordination or you don't. You don't need the computer to clean up your line or whatever. I don't consider myself a good letterer, even though all that lettering is by hand. And when I don't like my lettering, sometimes I go in with the computer and tweak it. But okay, make a long story short, this series pretty much launched my career in the small press, and from there I went to DC Comics. I definitely rethought the mistake of not taking up that Legion of Superheroes audition, and some of my earliest work at DC Comics ended up being Legion of Superheroes work. And I got to eventually work on cool projects like this with nice Mr. Stanley. And now we're going to take some time to talk about breaking in. I mean, we've talked about how I broke in, but it's probably not very relevant to how you broke in. And one of the most important things you have to have if you're trying to break into the mainstream is samples pages that actually show the mainstream characters. It's quite odd that I see a lot of samples from people when, I want to work for Marvel, I want to work for DC. Marvel and DC is really interested in seeing what you do with their property. So you need to have some of those samples in your portfolio. You need to target your portfolio to the client. And again, like not having any continuity in your portfolio, 9 times out of 10, I see portfolios that just don't seem to have any focus at all. I don't know what the stuff is in there, but they're not targeted for the client. One of the things I used to do when I would make the rounds in New York is I would have chunks of my portfolio separated so that every time I went to a different client, I would have different samples to show a particular client. I'd go to Marvel with certain samples, and DC with certain samples, and another publisher with certain samples. And I remember going to DC one day, and I had this scattershot portfolio art in there, and the DC art director really read me the riot act. And I thought about what he'd said. I mean, it was pretty harsh. And I was like, okay. So I rearranged the stuff in my portfolio. I went right to Marvel, And I got a job at Marvel that day because the DC editor gave me a lousy art review. And I said, you know what? He's probably right. This, I don't need to be showing an editor this stuff. I need to be more careful what I show. Went over to Marvel, got a job that day. So think about what you're showing and to whom you're showing it. And this is a small portion of my lecture about how to break in comics. There are two things you need to ask yourself. Do you really want to be a professional? I mean, is this what you want to do for a living? And do you really have anything to say to the public, or do you just like to write and draw? Fact of the matter is, if all you want to do is just write and draw and you just want to enjoy it and you just want to create, that's fine. You go do that. There are plenty of venues for you to do that. You do not need to make money at art to be an artist. You just need to make art. But to be a professional artist, you do have to think about whether or not you're going to be able to make a living at it. And you need to ask yourself these questions. What do I have to say? Is this a hobby or a profession? Do I need to make a profit or just get my investment returned? Should I just post it on a blog or, make a web comic and let people see it and I don't have to worry about making any money? And do you actually need to be in print? Do you actually need to have a book in your hand? Ask yourself those questions when you're sitting down deciding what you want your path to be. Now, I spent many years in self-publishing, and self-publishing is a great way to get your foot in the door. Putting your stuff on a blog is self-publishing. Putting your stuff on a webcomic is self-publishing. These are all legit venues for publishing. Anybody that says you haven't been published if you put your stuff on a website or a blog, that's not true. You have been published. But self-publishing really isn't that easy. You do get to keep all of the money that comes in, but you also have to pay all of the expenses, and there are more expenses than you might think. You have to provide your own financial, legal, production, and promotion support, or pay someone else to do so. This can end up being almost as expensive as getting a publisher, except you had to do all of the labor as well, and you may not have the expertise to do that labor well. Now, there's always print on demand. You want to see your work in print? Print on demand is great. You just print one book at a time. You don't have to carry an inventory. You can just, maybe print a dozen to test your market. This really reduces your risk. This is a great way to get your book into print and get it into the hands of fans at a show. So you've got a table at a convention, or maybe you want to show some samples when you go to a show. Do that. This may, however, turn off traditional publishers. If you decide to show them your sample in print, they'll go, well, this has already been published, we don't want to do it. So you might want to consider whether showing that as a published work to a potential client, you might want to think twice about that. But whatever, just if you're worried about that as a impediment, just say these are one of a dozen copies I printed as a sample. Now, a publishing deal can be a real nightmare, and I've had a few, but if it goes well, honestly, if my publishing deals continue to go as well as some of my publishing deals have lately, I'll never self-publish again. Upfront financial support. I don't have to come up with all that money. Yay. Invaluable editorial assistant. No one has complained about editors more than I have over the years, but a good editor is priceless. A marketing team, a promotion team, Legal support, somebody else handling your copyright and trademark issues, yay. Foreign publishing support, hot diggity. And access to licensors and film agents. That's really hard to do when you're just doing your own thing and self-publishing. And of course, by self-publishing, I mean also raising money by Kickstarter and other crowdfunding. I raise money on my Patreon by crowdfunding. So yeah, but these are all great things that go along with getting a publisher. And if you can bring in the money, you can get a good deal, but most books don't bring in the money. 93% of books sell less than 1,000 copies. Most small press or self-published books never move more than a few hundred copies. 9% of book orders account for 80% of all book sales. The entire publishing market is supported by less than about 5% of the authors. And virtually everything not produced by this small elite loses money. It's your job to prove to the client that you have a book that will sell. And almost all publishing money is in the backlist. When I say backlist, I mean a book that's been in print for a long time. Watchmen was printed in the 1980s. It's still in print and making money now. Sandman was printed in the 1990s. It's still in print and making money now. Evergreens, or perennials as those books are known, bring in new money year after year with little subsequent investment. And these books support the prime authors, but they also subsidize the search for new authors. So sometimes we get resentful seeing somebody like Stephen King or Neil Gaiman or one of these huge authors getting all the attention. Well, that money is partly invested in new authors. Now, after going over all the benefits of having a publisher, do you actually need one? And that depends entirely on what you want. A publisher can help establish your brand. If you get a series at Marvel or DC, for example, you are automatically getting seen by many, many people. However, many a mainstream creator has decided to self-publish and then failed miserably. Just because people are willing to buy your mainstream book and say 40,000 people buy your mainstream comic, that doesn't mean 40,000 people are going to buy the thing that you self-publish later. The self-publishing comics movement created a handful of successes, but left countless cartoonists in debt. Now, crowdfunding helps out a lot with that these days. If you don't reach your target, you don't necessarily produce your book, and publishing on the web is not entirely free. There are expenses to consider, and being popular on the web doesn't always translate to money. Sometimes it does. You can see people who've really not done very many books and have certainly never done very many books, but they've got a great big following on Instagram and boom, they raise a lot of money on Kickstarter. You never know. But other people, you just don't know. But these are not rules. These are just things to consider when you're thinking about how you want to take your career and how you want to break in. The independent press is a great way to reach focused, enthusiastic readers, but not such a great place to make a living. And mainstream publishers like Marvel and DC pay solid page rates, but rarely allow creators to retain rights to their work. One of the things that a lot of people don't get about working in the small press is that the time cost of the creation of the work is usually not returned, even if the book makes money. If you spent 3 weeks working on a book and you profited, $1,000 because you got $100 a page rate on your 10 pages, you only got paid $1,000 for 3 weeks of work. That's not a whole lot of money. I mean, it's better than nothing, but you probably would have made more money doing something else. That is one of the hard things to face about being independent and working in the small press, and hoping that eventually you will be able to break through and reach a wider audience, which, by the way, did happen to me. But a lot of people can't stick it out for the long haul. And to be perfectly honest, as I mentioned before, my first 10 years of working as a published creator, working on some very popular books, including my small press book, A Distant Soil. It sold as many as 40,000 copies, but I was generally making just a few $1,000s a year. You need to understand that no matter where you're going to work, whether you're working for yourself or you're working for other people, self-publishing does not mean that you are isolated from the rules and responsibilities of being a business person. You work with lots of people. You work with vendors, advertisers, licensors, etc. And this applies to all creative people, no matter what. You are a key person business. This is the riskiest kind of business because everything depends on one person, your ability to function. If anything happens to your ability to keep producing, the gravy train is off. If you don't have a backlist, and this is super important, the backlist will cover those times when you, the key person business, is not able to be productive. If I've got royalties coming in from, say, Sandman, for example, and I'm sick that month, that is how I make a living, because creative people don't get paid when they don't produce, unless you've got books earning royalties. And very, very important, everything you do is about one-on-one customer service. I don't mean necessarily with each and every person who buys your book, but I do mean with each and every client, every editor, every publisher, every assistant editor, your fellow creators. You are a business being represented by how you behave and interact with other people. And your ability to do this makes a difference, and I hate to say it, but if you are a woman or a person of color, how you behave is going to be counted against you more than it might be for certain other people. A lot will be expected of you, and anything you do that can be used against you will be used against other creators like you. Let's just call that out. And meeting clients applies even when you work. Rules about meeting clients applies even when you work for yourself. Keep your greetings polite. There are so many people that think that being snarky or using put-down humor or negging is going to get them remembered. It will get you remembered for all the wrong reasons. Know who you're dealing with. Research your potential clients or contracts in advance. Just going, wow, I want to work for Marvel Comics, or wow, I want to work for DC, that's not enough. You need to target the specific editor and the specific editor's line. Really know, don't just say, I want to work on Spider-Man. Really know that product. The more depth of understanding you have of the product line, whatever it is, the better you're going to increase your chances of getting in and staying in. Know the staff. Do not dismiss the flunkies, the secretary, the receptionist, the accounting people. Do not do that. They work just as hard as you do, and don't dismiss anybody just because they're not at the top of the food chain. This is a really important tip. Editors get all the attention, but assistant editors are easier to reach. Target the assistant editor. The big main editor is concentrating on the meat and potatoes, but the assistant editor is dealing with the scrum. You target that assistant editor. Be polite to that assistant editor. Treat them like the professional they are. They will remember that and appreciate it, because a lot of people don't do that. They treat them like they're disposable. And this is really, and the second one is so important. Don't act as if you want something. Everyone knows you want something. Everyone knows you want to get published. When you go to a client and it's all about me, 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 well, the client just saw 2,000 other people going me, 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 me. The client wants to know what you can do for them. Are you going to be able to make that client money? Are you going to make that client look good? That is what they want. Know the client, know their problem.